Right, we should be on. Evening all, welcome back to the channel. As you can see here tonight, I've got probably my biggest, well, definitely my biggest guest today in Nick Griffin, former leader of the BNP and member of the European Parliament. I did have an impromptu interview once with Tim Farron, but that wasn't a proper interview. That was a 2-3 minute thing in Bournemouth Town Centre. So very happy to have Nick here tonight, giving up his time. As I say, Nick is the former leader of the BNP, was during my teenage years quite a big deal, I'd say, back in the late noughties, early tens. We'll get into where he's been in the last decade or so and what's been going on in his life. But Nick, without further ado, can you give us a quick intro to yourself, please?
Yes, Dan, thanks for having me on. I'm looking forward to the show. So, as you said, I was notorious as the leader of the British National Party. I was elected to lead it in 1999 when it was, frankly, an unelectable political joke, and soon made it electable. And for about 10 years, it was the sub-story of every single election, apart from whatever the big issue was. It was how much damage is the BNP going to do to the consensus? How are we going to stop them? So it was very exciting times. In the end, they stopped us basically by promoting Nigel Farage and UKIP, which meant that inadvertently we caused the rise of UKIP to the stage that we got a referendum and we got a Brexit, which, as you know, is a very flawed Brexit in name only to an extent. But nevertheless, it did make an awful mess of the European Union, which is something of which I'm quite proud.
Brilliant. So Nick, can we talk you through your life, your introduction? So I know that you went to Cambridge. From my research into you for this podcast, you come from quite a political background. So can you talk us through your teenage years, getting into politics, Cambridge, the National Front, and the BNP after that?
Being involved in politics was, as you say, in the family, really, almost unavoidable. My parents met at a Communist Party meeting where they'd both gone as young Conservatives to heckle and cause trouble. And my mother was with a group of, she was at 17, with a group of very young Conservatives who were completely overawed. This was in North London by these very tough communist stewards, lots of them ex-servicemen, lots of them Jewish taxi drivers and so on, pretty tough. And they were very quiet when they're in the heckling. And there was a man 10 years older on the other side of the room who at one stage was standing on a chair, hurling abuse at the platform. And that was my father. So that was how my parents met. So I grew up in this very political household. Some of my earliest memories is being involved or watching as a child at Conservative campaign rooms, taking my tricycle up and down the road in 1964 with a Vote Conservative poster on my back. So, you know, I'm guilty as well. I was very much involved in the Young Conservatives until I joined the National Front at the age of 15, partly because the NF was saying just the blunt truth about immigration in the way that the Tories wouldn't, but also at the time because it was militantly fighting literally on the streets when it was attacked communism. And back in those early to mid 70s, there was a general feeling on the right and also on the left in British politics, actually, that Britain was going to follow the path of Finland in terms of becoming increasingly a satellite state of the Soviet Union, and in the end up being swallowed up. And the Conservatives, everybody else, talked about this but did nothing. And there was the National Front. When their meetings were attacked by the far left, they simply fought back, and that appealed to me. That's why I got involved.
So that appealed to you with the NF compared to the Conservative Party. Was there ever a temptation with yourself, obviously being a Cambridge graduate, to sort of hide in the background of the Tory party and progress through the ranks there? And eventually,
it was a bit late by then. That's what my father said. You know, you should do. He said, you can be a Tory MP, you can go right to the top. I think really politics is a greasy pole wherever you are. So if you can get to the top in one thing, you're quite possibly in the other. So he may have been right. But no, I joined the National Front at 15. When I went to Cambridge, I thought, I'll keep my mouth shut for a bit. So that lasted about 6 weeks before the Cambridge Union, the debating society, had a debate on this house would ban the National Front. So I went along, I was a member of the union, so I went and spoke. And I spoke for the motion, which was rather surprising. And I did it on the basis that all revolutionary movements had to go through a period of being illegal in order to toughen them up. Therefore, to ban the National Front would be to help it enormously. I'm not sure whether I believe that, but it was a debating trick, and it did work. The motion was defeated. But the following day, the student union newspaper came banging on my door, and I'd duly outed, doxed myself as a member of the National Front. So there was a point as I left university, having got a law degree, I was offered a place. This was the one moment really of decision. I was offered a place in a really good barrister's chambers on condition that I ditched the politics. And at that point I said, no, I'm not going to. So that was it. But by that stage, it would have been too late to join the Conservatives because, as you know, even Nigel Farage and co won't have ex-members of the BNP, and the National Front at that time was really just the same, if not marginally worse.
And how did being exposed as a member of the National Front at uni impact your uni experience?
It didn't make much difference, I think, in the college. Downing College was basically a sports college, and I was boxing, so I wasn't sort of in the college teams, but I was a sportsman, and no one really there seemed to care. But around the university, there was a horror wherever I went. There was a point the Socialist Workers' Party published a leaflet which they put out all over Cambridge with, in fact, the student union paper did as well, had a picture of what they thought was the window of my digs with an anti-Nazi arrow pointing to it. In other words, throw your brick here. This was slightly ironic because they got the wrong window. It was actually the window behind which lived the chief of the College Gay Society. So he was utterly appalled, lived in fear, I gather, for many months. For me, on the basis that these people were, seriously out to get me, and the SWP were militant in their words. They weren't necessarily tough. They were all middle-class students. By this stage, I've been running around for some years with, rough lads from the East End and Birmingham and so on. So they didn't bother me in that way. They were scared of me because I was a boxer. They didn't know I was a featherweight. So they're really probably not that dangerous. But I did at one stage, having had a lot of threats, I routed through a builder's skip and I found 6 or 7 pieces of cut-off rebar about that long. This is iron bars for anyone who doesn't know what a piece of rebar is. So I took them from the skip and I went along my route from college to my digs. And about every 40 yards where there was a bush or something similar, I hit one of these lumps of iron bar or steel bars, so that if I was confronted at any stage, I was probably only 20 yards, top whack, from one of my iron bars. I never needed them, but they were there just in case. So there was a degree of sort of tension there. Otherwise, it wasn't Cambridge at the time, near the university ragmag, the charity funding things. I still got a couple of them in the attic somewhere, and they were full of the most appalling racist jokes. That's still within the university. So it's not like academia became 20, 25 years later. So it didn't make that much difference, but it did make some.
I can't imagine iron bars at Cambridge. That's quite an interesting force. It's like to imagine that. Nick, a bit of a tangent on that one, actually. This just come to my head. You probably couldn't answer this question truthfully at the time, but maybe you can now. Were there ever unofficial links with football firms with the National Front and the BNP? Was that ever a thing? With
the NF, yes, definitely. We were involved. We had links with the West Ham lot, with the Chelsea headhunters in particular. I wasn't hugely impressed with them. They turned up to a Remembrance Day parade actually in central London that we had, where the left was supposed to be turning up mob-handed. And there was about, I think, 40 of them, the headhunters, and they were confronted by about 80 or 90 Marxists. And they duly made their excuses and left, which we wouldn't have done, because we knew that 40 of us were more than a match for 80 Marxists, and it wasn't even a fair contest if it came to a serious fight. But the football lads, I think, just took their own football experience, and when you're outnumbered by the other side, you're going to get hammered. So you leave. So I don't think that they were particularly effective. They're somewhat overrated. Having said which, there are some tough nuts and so on. And I probably later on will talk about the efforts to drive Britain towards a civil war. And part of that effort, undoubtedly, it's the same playbook as they used in the former Yugoslavia to wreck that state. And it actually started by mobilizing the football firms. So they are of interest to people wanting to cause trouble. I think that they tend to be indisciplined. As I say, they judge things by their own experience. So they're not particularly good political street fighters. But we had a few connections there. The British National Party didn't. A lot of sympathy at Rangers in particular. But we didn't really have any connection like that, certainly not in my time. And I've never heard of it in the time before I got involved in sort of 94, 95, when I first got involved. There was always, fellas that went to football. Not that many, fortunately. I've always said to people that it's a ghastly bread and circuses. If you're going to play football, fair enough. But to go and watch professional football at enormous expense, it's a sort of fake consciousness. It allows people to vent their tribal instinct in a completely useless and sometimes self-destructive way. So I think it's desperately bad. We would have used them if the opportunity arose and if there was a need, but neither was the case.
Okay, that's very interesting, Nick. Thank you. Before we move on to the next topic of the night, can you talk us through the success in becoming an MEP in 2009 and what led to that, and how, I don't know how long you could go on for about this before we move on, your experience of the European Parliament?
Yeah. Well, I should have become an MP in 2004. Actually, we had enough support in the Northwest even then. And in order to stop us, they turned the poll in the Northern England seats. I don't know if it was all over England or just in Yorkshire and the Northwest. The poll was made all postal on the basis it would have a higher turnout, it would keep out the BNP. This was passed, it went through the House of Commons on the nod. In the House of Lords, there was some resistance to the idea of just gerrymandering the whole electoral system just to keep out Nick Griffin, which is what several of the Labour MPs who spoke for this change in the House of Lords said: if you vote against this, you will get Nick Griffin elected in the northwest of England. So you've got to vote for this change in the law. So they did vote in the change in the law. It was all postal. And huge numbers of our ballots, we know for sure, were spoiled. We know that for two reasons. We had a number of calls from supporters, sympathisers working in town halls, very often, the lower level, the cleaners and the electricians and so on. And they were saying, look, every single lunchtime, there's some of the top ones, these leftist scumbags, going into the room where the ballots are, and they're just led there, and they're taking away handfuls of your ballot papers, and they're bringing you back spoiled. So we had that anecdotally, and when we saw at the count, there was tens of thousands of spoiled ballot papers, and quite often, because they'd already been sort of separated out by this stage when we saw them. Quite often, you see dozens of these votes where all the votes for the BNP were in different hands, sometimes even different pens, pencils, and so on. Some were very firm, some were little shaky old lady type X's, all sorts of X's, some giant ones, everything like that. And then you'd have 50 or 60 little neat crosses next to the ultra socialist candidate, which thereby 2 votes, ballot papers invalid. So we were robbed in that one. Otherwise, I'd have been an MEP for 10 years. So the second time around in 2009, we were looking, what do we do about this? It was now not a full postal ballot, but there was still an awful lot of people voting by post, a huge number. And we knew that we had some votes amongst those, and we worked the postal votes very, very hard, because someone with a postal vote is far more likely to vote in an election. So you identify them off the previous electoral roll, and you identify them as a voter, and you make a point of knocking their door, you get them extra literature, etc., etc. So we hit the postal votes very hard, but we knew there was no point if our postal ballots, they were going to be opened every single day during about the last 14 days of the poll, and then kept in the council ballot boxes, which were basically sort of like a cardboard box with council seals on. So we said to the council, we're not happy with this. So they said, well, they're sealed. We said, yes, they're sealed by your people with the seals that they've got unlimited numbers of, so it's not secure at all. And they said, well, tough, that's the rules. We found out it wasn't quite the rules, because there was a law from going back to the very early 20th century, which stated, we don't even know if anyone had ever used it, but it states very clearly that any political party can affix its own seals to the ballot boxes. So we had 42 or 44 counting centres in the northwest of England, and we had a team, a rota, so that we had someone there every single day when the postal votes were counted, and every single day they put our seal on the ballot box, which the ballots were being kept in, as on top of the council seals. Now, in most of the areas, the council workers, the bloke in charge, returning officer, said, well, never seen this before, but, you know, okay, fair enough, no harm. Some of the areas, Manchester, Liverpool, places like that, with a hardcore militant type Labour Party apparatchiks running the show, they went ballistic about this. And they were calling the police. These people are trying to interfere with the ballots and so on. So we thought this, well, we knew this was going to happen. So we'd given all our volunteers had chapter and verse of the electoral rules, which showed that they're entitled to do this. So the police officers all, when questioned, said, you know, well, nothing we can do. Sorry. So we did that. As a result of that, the number of spoiled ballot papers absolutely crashed. And I was elected by, this is in a constituency with 4.4 million potential voters, and I was elected by fewer than 1,000 votes. That was my majority over the second UKIP candidate. UKIP won easily, and then it's a very complex voting system was used, the D'Hondt formula used for the European elections.
Is it half from memory? It halves.
You get someone elected, and then your remaining votes are halved.
Yeah.
So you've got to have a lot of votes to get someone else elected. So we squeaked in, just beating UKIP and about 1,500 votes ahead of the Greens. But if we hadn't had that immense effort to seal all our ballot papers, then we'd have been robbed a second time. So that's how I ended up there in 2009.
That's fascinating. When we think of electoral fraud, I guess we think of third world countries or maybe America 2020. But it sounds like it happens.
Just one more example of the sort of electoral frauds that we had. In Stoke, we were very strong there, but before we became strong, the Labour Party had created an elected mayor of Stoke, which they thought was, you know, theirs by right. Used to weigh, even then, used to weigh Labour votes rather than count them, you know, in Stoke. So that was their position by right forever. And then we came very, very close, and that was a system where you had a second preference vote. And the second preference votes were only counted if you were the first or second party. After that, they weren't counted. So they made sure that we didn't make the second party. We were very close behind the Tories. We were almost the second party, in which point our second preference votes would have been counted. And they stopped that by, instead of the post office sending out or delivering every party's leaflets on the free post randomly and separately, everyone was in a booklet, which was delivered. The booklet, obviously, in the previous elections, the booklet was always delivered before the postal ballot papers arrived, obviously, logically. So this time, when we were a real threat, the booklet didn't arrive for several days after the ballot papers, with the result that when the booklet arrived, we had literally hundreds of people from Stoke phoning up over the next couple of days. So our phone number was at the bottom of our mini manifesto. We had hundreds of people phoning up the line saying, I'd have voted for you if I knew you were standing. I'd have voted for you if I knew what you were saying. Is it possible to change my vote? So, of course, it wasn't. So with that and a host of other tricks.
Sorry, Nick, would you class that as fraud or just dirty tricks?
That's a dirty trick. That's a dirty trick. But in Stoke, where we come on to a different form of fraud, so gerrymandering, we come on to this in a moment. Despite this, we just missed being elected, and therefore our second preference vote wasn't counted. But it was one of our people overheard two of the most senior Labour Party officials as they left the hall speaking about it. And one said to the other, the unspoken story of the night, which must stay unpublished, was the huge fascist second preference vote, i.e. the BNP. Because, of course, virtually everyone voting Labour, because they really hated the Tories, was voting BNP second, and everyone who was voting Tory, because they couldn't stand the thought of the Labour Party getting in again, was voting BNP second. So we had a swamping vote. So the next time this came up, knowing by this time we were even stronger, they'd changed council ward boundaries to stop us. We'd overridden all of this. We were stronger. So the third time this came up, they dealt with the fact that BNP was going to win it simply by abolishing the position of Mayor of Stoke. There you go.
It's interesting. Very interesting. I didn't know any of that. So no, thank you, Nick. I guess that's enough about you for now. No, I'm joking. Yeah. We'll move on. Move on to the next topic of the night, which was, is to do with Rupert, Lowe, and Restore. Now, if you bear with me, I'll sort of give my thoughts on this before you respond. There's been a lot of excitement, obviously, on what you call right-wing Twitter or X to do with the launch of Restore. I did read your Substack on this a few weeks ago. So I've got a few thoughts on this. You talked at the start about Zionism and the party's soft support or hard support for Zionism. And in preparation for this tonight, I didn't waste my bank holiday weekend. I did watch your 2009 Question Time appearance. And there was one comment you made on it, because I'm aware of your X activity to do with the Middle East, which really threw me. And this may have been a political comment at the time. I don't know if you remember it or not. You essentially said that the BNP was the only party which supported Israel's, I'm paraphrasing, Israel's right to defend itself against Hamas terrorists. That really threw me, but we'll just pause that for a second. I'd like you to respond to that in a second.
Yeah, so it's quite a big story, that one, actually, in a way. Okay. So, yeah, we'll deal with that in a moment.
Okay. You go on in the Substack to talk about there's no electoral prospect of Restore winning in 2029, and that you think it's fantasy that people on right-wing Twitter are even suggesting that can happen. So can you go into a bit more detail about those two topics, and also a third sort of sub-question on this? Would Nick Griffin vote for reform based off that Substack? I'm not convinced you would. I just want to know.
Shall we deal with this chronologically then? Sure. And deal with the Question Time thing first. So I actually said that, or meant to say, that the BNP, we accept the right of Israel to attack Hamas. We also accept the right of the Palestinians to attack Israel, because it's not our fight. That's it. It's not our fight. Now, this came about. I'm fully in support of the Palestinian cause. Now and all through. I can't be in support of Hezbollah or anyone like that, because it's illegal. So I'm not. But I'm fully in support of the Palestinians' right to establish a secular Palestinian state in which a significant number of especially ultra-Orthodox Jews say they'd be happy to live because they regard the Zionist state as a blasphemy. But that's by the by. Anyway, that's my position. But a year before, a little bit under a year before the Question Time, I was approached through our press office by a man by the surname of Mort. Mort was the surname he gave. And he was a clearly very well-connected young Jewish activist. And he said, we'd like to meet you. I'm meeting you on behalf of a broader block of people. We want to meet and discuss the possibility of cooperation. So I said, okay, I'll meet you. So we met at a pub near Rickmansworth and sat for several hours and talked things over. And his thing that blew my mind, actually, he said, we've already given you a lot of help. So I said, well, what do you mean? So he said, well, don't you remember the article in the Daily Star? The Daily Star was absolutely our demographic at the time. And I did indeed remember the Daily Star approached us, again, some months before this, and said, we think that we've been rather unfair on you, actually. And we've been looking, and a lot of us readers support you, so we'd like to be fair. So we want to do an interview, and we'll run a big story on you. So God, I wasn't born yesterday, but we'll do the interview. But it's not going to be fair. No way. Anyway, this thing came out, and it was so ridiculously, sycophantically pro BNP and bigging me up that if they'd asked me to write it, I wouldn't have dared to write it. I wouldn't have had the cheek to write this thing. It was a crazed piece, publicity puff piece. And he said, well, that he said, Richard Desmond, he's one of ours. You can have as much good publicity like that in the Star as you want. And we can also get you some in some of the other papers as well. But the Star is going to be the main one, but it's your demographic. And then he said, do you remember the White Season? Now, the White Season was a series of 5 or 6 weekly TV programs, documentaries, about basically immigration. It was about white as in, being white. And one of them was about the last white kids in a street in Bradford. Another one was about a working man's club in a heavily Muslim area, just gradually dying on its feet for demographic reasons. And they were all basically just bigging up our vote. This was in 2008. It was an incredible series. The advert for it was, well, there were several. One of them was a British bulldog sitting in a park, and a succession of obviously foreign dogs, Great Danes and poodles and Afghan hounds, came along, raised their legs and pissed on it. And that was, this is how white people are feeling in Britain today. Do you feel like this? This is the Goebbels-esque levels of propaganda, quite astounding. And even more than that, there was one where the advert for this whole series was a tight close-up on the face of obviously a white working class man, typical white van man. And a brown hand came across and wrote in ink on his face in Urdu or something similar. And then another one, and then something in some East European language, and he was written over until his face turned black. Now it was staggeringly powerful propaganda. So this Andrew Mort said to me, we did that, all of them, in order to boost you. And I went and checked, and out of the 6 programs, 5 of them were produced by, they were also shown on Channel 4, but 5 of them were produced by small independent Jewish TV companies. The 6th one was done by a group of Sikhs. So Mort said, you can have as much of that as you want. So I said, well, it all depends, why, what's going on here. And I said, if you people have realized that for demographic reasons and so on, that Israel actually isn't safe long term for you, or it might be a problem. So if you decided now that you need a life raft, then that's
sorry, Nick, Israel isn't safe.
Yeah, that's what
What do you mean? Sorry?
That's what I suggested, that long term Israel.
Sorry. Okay. Sorry.
Long term Israel may not survive.
Okay.
Or at least maybe seriously risky. So are you people wanting a life raft that you can bail out to? And if that's the case, then despite the fact that overwhelmingly the campaign to push the spearhead of the campaign to push mass immigration on Britain and through the law to silence opposition to it was overwhelmingly through radical left-wing and radical Zionist Jews. That was where the pressure for mass immigration has always come from. There's, the capitalists want it for cheap labour, obviously, and the general left want it because they're just anti-British. But the key part of this was always from, as I said to him, mainly radical left-wing Jews. So I said, if you now are radical right-wing Jews and you've decided that was a mistake, then we'll work with you. And we're not the people who hold grudges. So if you're going to help us like that, it's so important to us that I will do my level best to decommission the anti-Semitism there is in the BNP. And you know why? Because every single organisation that's opposed us over years, and the National Front before that, and mostly before that, was organised by your people. So if you will help us now, I'll try and decommission all of that. And I said, we'll go as far as we will take, instead of saying we support basically the Palestinians, we will take an absolutely neutral line on Israel. And we talked about this. He said, that sounds quite good. And then he said, well, what about, would you do more than that? So I said, no, we're nationalists. If you want us to back your wars, then forget it. No deal. Absolutely. I wouldn't, whatever you could give us, money. And he was talking, there's also money and so on. Money, TV coverage, newspapers, none of it is acceptable if the price is us saying we support Israel. But we will be neutral. And he said, well, I'll take it. We shook hands and so on at the end of this very long conversation. And he said, I'll take it back to my people and we'll see. Never heard from him or from them again. But from that day onwards, it was basically a war of political extermination against the British National Party from these people. But still, as far as I was concerned, there was still a question mark over this. So in question time, I bit my lip and made this comment, which showed that I was sticking to my proposed side of the bargain, that we'd be strictly neutral. So, yeah, the Israelis are entitled to throw bombs that way, and the Palestinians are entitled to throw bombs that way. Ain't nothing to do with us.
Did this man ask you to focus on Islam or in criticism of Islam?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely so. When the National Front was approached in a vaguely similar way by a rabbi from North America, Rabbi Meir Schiller, there we were, Islam wasn't a thing. This was in the 1980s. And we were simply asked to support Israel and to stop criticizing the banking system. And we said no to that. But this time around, Islam was a thing. And yeah, he wanted us to focus on Islam, so much less about immigration. You know, if you're talking about immigration, black people and so on, you know, there's some of they're the readers of some of these papers. It's much more difficult. They're integrated, blah, blah, blah. Talk about Muslims. And we were already talking about Muslims and continued talking about Muslims on the grooming gangs thing. And on the thing, of course, which is going back, everyone is now talking about the grooming gangs and trying to ignore the fact that apart from Anne Cryer, who did her bit locally in Halifax, no one else was touching this except the British National Party. It nearly got me jailed twice talking about this. But at the time, we were also talking about the other side of this punk Islamist coin, which was the grooming of young girls, but a systematic wave of violent racist attacks on young lads, up to and including murder. And apart from Chris Donald, he's the only one who's remembered. All the others have been forgotten. And all the people who are trying to push to drive white Britain, white working class Britain, mad with hatred against Muslims over the grooming thing, they never mentioned this side at all. But we were talking about that. So we were talking about the problems which came with Islam, and especially radical Islam. We were talking about those before Mr. Mort came along, and we continued doing so afterwards. But we always said it's not just a matter of the Muslim population. Mass immigration from the third world is bad, regardless of the faith, religion, or lack of it of those involved.
Sorry, Nick. So are you saying that obviously everyone's aware nowadays of the rape gangs, the vermin they are? Are you saying that in a similar way white lads used to be attacked in previous decades? Because I'll tell you, I've only ever heard from family and friends, I can't use the term, was Pakistani bashers, for example. I've only ever heard that side of it. The
Paki bashers, it was a wicked thing, stupid,
Nick, sorry,
vicious.
can you be careful with the language on the channel, sorry.
Oh, sorry. Yes.
You're on YouTube.
I'm using it, I'm condemning it. That's what it was called, and it's still talked about, and that's how they describe it. I'm condemning absolutely. It was wicked from the start, but it was something that happened in the 1960s. It didn't happen from the 80s onwards. The bashing was all the other way, and you had no areas for white lads on the edges of every single Muslim ghetto area in Britain, and there were scores of white lads beaten or stabbed to death over those 5 or 6 years. We actually ran a campaign, Racism Cuts Both Ways. And that was a big campaign. Our campaign on that was even bigger than the one that we did on the grooming gangs, because it was absolutely in your face and no one was talking about it. And to this day, no one talks about it. As with the grooming gangs, it has retreated to a degree. It's receded. Most of the grooming gangs who are now still being brought to justice, it's historical things from years ago, and they should be brought to justice. They should be castrated, as far as I'm concerned, and then deported. But they're mostly, it's in the past, and most of that violence has also calmed down. So the grooming, the sex attacks that are going on now are not being done by groups of young men from that community. They're being done by tiny groups or individuals of very recently arrived boat migrants, who are also occasionally stabbing and attacking white lads, but on nothing like the same scale. But it was a huge problem. And it's still an injustice which cries out to heaven to be put right.
I'll be honest, I don't know if it's because I'm originally from London or the South, not aware of that.
There was plenty of it down there as well. There's plenty of it down there. And so you had, obviously, Chris Donald in Glasgow is the only one just about remembered. but Gavin Hopley in Oldham, Ross Parker in Peterborough. There were dozens. Richard Everett in just near Euston Station, 15-year-old lad. There were scores of them, including down in London, especially in the East End. It was a really big thing.
Interesting. I've only ever heard the other side, I'll be honest. No, thank you for that. It was very interesting about your question time answers. Thank you, Nick. So if we move on now to like the next, with Restore, with the next subset, Restore yes. and Reform.
Yeah.
Why is it politically impossible for Restore to win in 3 years or 8 years?
It's utterly ludicrous. On Thursday, Nigel Farage, Reform, are going to sweep the board throughout the Red Wall and in many Tory shires as well. They're going to take over 1,000 seats, or it'll be a jaw-dropping failure. They're going to take a huge number of seats. There's no doubt about it. And the political elite will go absolutely ape about it. And they'll, all of them, be condemning Farage and saying this is appalling and blah, blah, blah. And they'll be suggesting, should we actually ban this party? What on earth are we going to do? And although the echo chamber, which is X and social media, and X is an absolute echo chamber because Elon Musk has got the algorithms tweaked to a point that serious radical nationalists like me, we virtually don't exist. The reach is we're nailed to the floor. Whereas the Tommy Robinson types, the fakes, they're all over the place and they are pushing Rupert Lowe like mad. But outside of that echo chamber, the masses of people, millions and millions of voters, are going to see Reform become even more clearly the way in which to kick the Labour Party. They're going to see Reform being the people who are so far ahead of the Tories that in the next election, the Tories are going to suffer from the old wasted vote argument. You might want to vote Tory, but if you vote Tory instead of Reform, you are going to get a Labour, Green, Islamist, Marxist, SNP government. You've got to vote Reform, you can't vote Tory. The idea that Rupert Lowe can break through that in 3 years' time, it is truly childish. It's pathetic. The people they've allowed themselves to get so wound up and so scared of what's happening to Britain. And it is scary. But they're in such a blue funk about the idea that in 25 years' time, we're going to be a minority and we're all going to get murdered on our beds. This is all bullshit. In 25 years' time, when we become a minority, we'll be the largest minority in a nation of minorities. And the liberalism and the softness, which came from being top dog on the majority, is rapidly going to get pushed out of the British people. And things will change. And if we're a well-organised minority, being the biggest minority, with other minorities like the Sikhs and the Christian Africans and all the rest of it, and even the hardcore Muslims when it comes to things like LGBT poison in schools, we can do deals with all these people and we'll all be jostling at the trough. And once we're no longer liberal and our communities are properly organised, we will get our fair share. Now, that's not a good end, obviously. That's why I spent my whole life opposing mass immigration, saying this is what is going to happen. But if that's going to happen, it's no reason to be so terrified that you have to start waving magic wands or writing letters to a political Father Christmas that Rupert Lowe magically is going to overcome Reform and come to power in 2029. It is nonsense, particularly because one of the reasons I look at what Rupert Lowe is doing and how a man who must be fairly clever, because he made a lot of money in the city with trading and so on, he must be fairly clever. So for him to be telling people we're going to win in 2029, I actually have I have to wonder if actually Nigel Farage has put him up to it. Because Nigel Farage is a very, very, I'm not saying he did, but it's a possibility. Nigel Farage is a brilliant politician. That's not praise. I always regarded being called a politician as an insult. Yeah, because politicians, they lie and they wheel and they cheat. So politicians are the scum of the earth. They're way lower than estate agents, who are much maligned, actually. But Farage is a brilliant politician. He's the big political beast of this era. And he's very sharp. And he knows perfectly well that the reason that UKIP, precursor to Reform, was able to get where it did and to break out of just being a party of protest at European elections was the fact that the British political elite and media elite in general, and the BBC in particular, was terrified of Nick Griffin and the BNP. And he did a deal with the BBC to promote him against me. So I was lynched once on Question Time. He was on 22 times in the same period when, under the BBC rules, both of our parties having at least 2 MEPs in the European Parliament, but no MPs, we were entitled to the same number of appearances, namely twice a year. I got lynched once, he was on 22 times. They put him on Have I Got News for You and stuff like that. So they boosted Farage up. And also there was another advantage for Farage of the BNP, that Britain, as you know, has got a fair few people driven insane by the injustice of what's been done to our people, and often what's been done to their family, and they're absolutely full of hate against Muslim people and black people and Jewish people and so on, beyond all reason. But they want to get involved in politics. So they used to come into the BNP and we try and calm them down. And we try and stop them wanting to go and throw bricks through windows and do sensible political stuff. We try and get them to moderate their language. Because we were getting them, Nigel never got them. So the BNP was a poultice which drew away this poison from Nigel Farage's movement. Now the BNP has gone, and it's been gone several years, as you know, some years, he's increasingly facing the problem. Well, the circumstances which allowed us to rise where we've risen to are no longer there. There's no hard right party which terrifies the media. There's no hard right party which keeps the thugs of the left physically involved attacking it. And bear in mind that when people like Hope Not Hate or the trade unions and so on, when they organise campaigns against the fascists, it's a business, Dad. It's a business. It brings in money. We're their stock in trade. They have to have a fascist thread of some sort. And if there's no hard line party, then they will turn all their guns on Reform and Nigel Farage. He doesn't want that. And worst of all, you get all these crazies joining Nigel because he's the most right-wing thing on the block, which is credible. So there's 3 very good reasons for Nigel Farage to want to have something to his right, muscling its way around and looking really important, when he knows perfectly well that come an election, people they're no longer making protest about their local council or using the European elections to kick the Labour Party or the Tories or whatever. They are now deciding who is going to be the next Prime Minister. And the only choice will be the successor to Keir Starmer or Nigel Farage. And there might be 5 or 6 million people who want to vote Restore because Rupert Lowe says all the right things. And it's a very slick social media operation. And it's being plugged by the whole of the neocon and counter-jihad Zionist media operation. So millions of them are going to want to vote for him. Come the day, they will have a choice. And they'll think, if I vote Rupert Lowe, I'm going to get Angela Rayner, or whoever it is. So, sorry, Rupert, I will vote for Reform. I know this will happen. It happens, you probably remember in the Substack I wrote, the first one I wrote about the subject, I went into a bit of detail about 1979 and the National Front. In 1977 and 78, the National Front became briefly England's third party. We displaced the Liberals, so it was Labour, Tory, National Front. It was huge in terms of mass support. And then Maggie Thatcher said one word, swamped. She said, I understand that the British people feel they're being swamped by immigration. She didn't even say, we're going to stop immigration, we're going to deport 500,000, anything like that. No promises, just I understand people feel they're being swamped. We've got to do something about it. And I was campaigning in Ipswich, was more or less my hometown at the time. And we got a fantastic support as we went round Ipswich in the last couple of weeks, mainly with a loudspeaker car and so on. Honks of support, waves, thumbs up. 10 times the number of votes we actually got in the end, which was less than 500. And I spoke to some people and say, I'd love to vote for you. You're absolutely right. I really can't stand the Tories. But Maggie has said she's going to do something about immigration and she can get elected. You can't. So sorry, I'm not going to vote for them. I'm going to vote for you. I'm going to vote for them. And exactly the same thing will happen in 2029. Now, if Rupert Lowe was...
Sorry, just before you move on too far, I understand what you're saying about Farage, but I guess 2 points I'd push back on is the Farage use of Rupert Lowe incident where he was chucked out of Reform. and arrested and everything. And surely, let's just say in theory, Restore get 3 or 4% of the vote in 2029. Surely if Reform go from 30 to 26, 27, that would be hugely detrimental. So I take your point about the business aspect, but surely those two aspects would be really nice.
Overall, I think that Lowe is probably a loose cannon being promoted by and encouraged and incited by the counter-jihad operation, and that on balance, I think probably Nigel has nothing to do with it. I merely raise it as it's a possibility. If it is, then what will happen is I would suspect that although Lowe is going to keep his 120,000 members and rising by the day, hanging on for the next 3 years, doing nothing, which is my problem with it. They should be organising in our communities, organising our communities as Indigenous communities. They should be working. Instead, they're not. They're sitting saying, we'll all vote. It's all going to come all right. It's an excuse for total idleness. It's really, really wrong. But if Lowe is in cahoots with Farage, all that will happen just before the election, they'll do a deal, and Rupert will simply announce, Nigel has agreed to stand down against me in Great Yarmouth, and in return, we're not fighting against them because it would only let the Labour Party in. And his people can't do anything about it, because in order to stand these days for a political party, you have to have the signature of the nominating officer, who is one of Rupert Lowe's closest men. So it simply won't happen. They won't stand anywhere. Then they don't get the 3%. So that's entirely possible. That he's still that will be the end result. On the other hand, it's possible that Lowe is an incited loose cannon, in which case he's staggeringly stupid, because I pointed out, and it's blatantly obvious, that he can't win in 2029. At most, what could happen, as you say, supposing they got 6% of the vote, then that basically means Reform probably win 40 or 50 seats, no more than that. They get 8%, Reform don't win any. And then we get, by default, we get a bigger left bloc landslide than we saw last time around. That's the best that Rupert Lowe could do. He certainly can't win. But if he were to say on account of that, we're going to spend the next 3 years, my army of 150,000 people, which will be in a couple of months, and the 2 million present a year that the membership alone brings in, and they don't get anything for it, so it's simply money coming in. So we're going to spend that £2 million and more money that we can raise on real in-depth local community building, and especially we're going to get to work registering voters. Because, you know, Dan, there's 10 million people in Britain not registered to vote. That's people, I'm not talking illegal immigrants, they're not entitled to vote. There's 10 million people who are entitled to vote, but not even on the electoral register. Now, a few of them will be young, feral Africans and so on in London and Birmingham, who are simply outside the whole political process. It's certainly not the Muslims, the Sikhs or the Hindus, because all those groups, and for that matter, the Black African Christians and so on, they understand that votes is power, and they all make sure their people are registered to vote. So the people who aren't registered to vote, about 8 million of them are white working class Brits. And they're not registered to vote because they think all politicians are scum. They're all in it for themselves and they won't make any difference. But Rupert Lowe has enough of an outrageous factor that his people knocking on doors in their own communities could get those people to vote. I know it can work because we did it in the BNP in one experimental place up in Cumbria. And in a town of 6,000 people, we registered an extra 800 voters. It took us 5 months of a small group of people door knocking 3 or 4 times a week. We knocked some doors 8 or 9 times to find somebody in. And then we'd ask them if they'd vote for us. If they weren't supportive, we said, thank you very much, and went away. If they were supportive, we got them to register, and where possible, we got them postal votes. If Lowe did that we had about 200 units with 12,000 people as members. Lowe's got 10 times that. He could have 1,000 operating units. He could spend some money training them. And the main thing they could do would be to mobilise this enormous white working class vote, which 8 million people is twice what Nigel Farage got at the last general election. Keir Starmer was only elected with 9 million votes. It's a vast number. And if Lowe was serious, he'd say to his people, we won't stand in 2029. Don't worry. We're going to work. In 2029, Nigel will get elected, and you'll know he'll let us down. We do. We'll know that if he deports a fraction of the 400,000 he's now said he's going to deport over 5 years, that'll be more than balanced by the huge number of Indians he's going to let in, because Reform's policy is quite actually open, although people don't understand it. It's not no immigration. It's net zero immigration. For every Brit who leaves, for every Brit who dies, you've got to have 2 people in to maintain the balance, because that's what the capitalist system needs. And Nigel is there for the capitalist system. So he will let his voters down. And if Rupert Lowe and co were organised for after that, then they could become a very powerful force, not least for the last thing I'll say on this before we move on, is that when Farage gets people elected in large numbers, it always turns out that within a few months, a lot of them are leaving him, they can't work with him, or he axes them or whatever, and they defect. Who are they going to defect to in the House of Commons? So they could defect to the Tories, but the Tories are a busted flush. But why would they defect, even if Rupert Lowe does get re-elected, why would they go to him when he's got nothing to offer them at grassroots level? If he spent the next 3 years building a community-level organisation, the most powerful right-wing organisation this country will ever have seen is within his grasp, then all those people wanting to leave Reform, MPs, would understand, if I switch to Restore, I've got a real chance of being elected at the next general election, and they would do so. So Rupert Lowe would very rapidly going from being from one man to being one of the most powerful blocks in Parliament, keeping Nigel Farage and co in office as long as they did what he told them. So that's what he's throwing away with this childish nonsense about overcoming Farage and co and winning in 2029. Something strange is going on.
I think both parties as well are very, it's not a nice thought. Imagine if next week Farage or Lowe were hit by a bus, both parties would just collapse because they're one-man bands. But before we move on to the next topic, this wasn't advertised because it only came out in the news yesterday. See Yousif's announcement about putting these migrant detention centres in green areas. I've had mixed views on this, because part of me thinks people that vote green, they prefer immigration. I kind of get it. But at the same time, I guess you've got areas where Reform might get 30% of the vote and come second, and those locations would still get those senators if the Greens win. And it could be seen as quite a malicious thing where people actually are turned off by Reform. But I don't know if you've got any views yourself.
I think it's just about they are aware that Restore, they're not breathing down their necks, but they are a danger for the split vote problem. And so Farage is carefully calibrating the party to the right, and a little bit of sort of outrageous stuff. It's not a serious policy, but it's something that ordinary people in the pub near me say, yeah, give them some, that's what they need. So it just helps to sink in and maintain the fact that Rupert Lowe isn't the only one who's telling it like it is, an immigration is willing to do something. So it's just a little bit of manoeuvring, and I don't think it's actually serious. No, I don't think is it a good thing? It's quite funny, isn't it? But it's very unfair on those people. And what proportion of the population might elect a Green MP? 25% of the voters in a close contest, but only 50% are going to vote. So that's only 12.5%. And 10 million people aren't registered to vote. So it's about 10% of the population, top whack, in a given area, votes Green. And as a punishment, they get a load of asylum seekers dumped on them. So the only thing I will say is I used to say, and still to a degree say the same thing, or something vaguely similar, which is that I have a certain schadenfreude when people in a very rich area like Horsham or whatever, when they suddenly find that an immigrant centre in their patch, in an old RAF base in their patch or whatever, is devaluing their properties. Well, boo bloody who? Because when it was white working class communities being smashed to buggery and having their girls gang raped and all the rest of it, these snobbish bastards didn't want to know. And they sneered down their noses at the BNP because we were knuckle dragging working class scum. So now they get a bit of what they should have helped their poorer compatriots stand against in the first place. So I'm not totally eaten up with sympathy for the middle classes in these leafy lanes are now suffering what ordinary people have suffered for a long time.
Thank you, Nick. We've taken 55 minutes to do 2 of the 5 topics of the night because you can talk. Okay. So we'll move on.
Well, you've got a choice. You can either rush me through or you can park 1 or 2 of them, or we come back another time. So
okay, we'll just see how we go. We'll see how we go.
You have to tell me because I can talk. I make up a donkey, as you know.
No, that's fine. We'll keep going. Nick, talk now about the prospect, or your view that some are encouraging the prospect of civil conflict, civil war in the UK. So I'm of an Irish background. The one that comes to my mind is always Northern Ireland, where you had 2 very distinct communities, both large communities.
Your family Northern Irish, by the way, or Republic?
No, the Republic side. Yeah, the Catholic side. So obviously the Catholic community in Northern Ireland's grown, and it's overtaken the Protestant community now. But it was always 2 very big, distinct communities fighting each other, conflict, all the rest of it. In Britain, it's not the case. There's a much, what's the word I'm looking for? There's lots of different groups. Yes. There's not 2 clear big groups, especially in places like London, Birmingham, etc. So why do you think some are encouraging civil conflict? And I guess I'm a bit lost about who the actual conflict would be between, who would be on each side.
Well, you're right in terms of the sheer diversity. It does actually, to a degree, diffuse the problem. When it's just one group A against group B, and they're rubbing up against each other, and there's no one else there, that's when it's at its worst. Which, bear in mind, if you judge by London, yeah, it's not really like that. If you go to Birmingham, actually, it is. It's very, very divided. And if you go anywhere else, especially in the Midlands and the North, it's the Pakistanis and the whites. And the level of hostility between those 2 communities is far greater than the level of hostility that existed between ordinary people, Prods and Catholics, in Northern Ireland in the 1960s. And I know that for absolutely sure. I spent lots of time there. I've spoken with elderly people. I've been to the Royal Anglians Military Museum, and they had a lot of time in the Troubles, spoken with people who were there. So I can tell you for sure, we could go into it at length if you want, but there's more basic tension between some of the communities in Britain now, mainland Britain, than there was in Northern Ireland before the Trouble was racked up. And then there is a problem in some areas, say Leicester is a good example, where indeed, who's going to fight who? Because it's not just the whites, most of whom have fled to Leicestershire. It's not just the whites, it's also the Muslims and the Hindus. Now, the ones who came to Leicester in 1972 from Uganda, they were mainly middle-class shopkeepers. And basically, they kept out of the way of the Muslims, and the Muslims thought they ran the place. The Indians, the Hindus arriving in Britain now are much more working class. They're coming direct from India, and they're much tougher. And they're being pushed by the BJP government in India, all over the world, in Canada and Britain and so on. They're pouring quite hardline militant Hindu propaganda into their communities and money as well, because they want to turn them into lobby groups in other countries on behalf of India. So Leicester's got the capacity, it nearly came to it a couple of years ago. It was on the verge of exploding between 2 groups of thems, not us at all. But overall, the people who are supposed to form the backbone of the coming civil war in Britain are the Muslims against the rest. Now, I've always, as you know, been particularly against Muslim immigration because it's a more problematical thing, because these people are bound together by a common faith and a set of values which are different to ours. And therefore, there's a problem of, it's not a matter of assimilating. I don't want my people to assimilate with them, because assimilation is a form of genocide anyway. It's not a question of integrating. It's a matter of getting on together and sort of rumbling along. And having people who are so very different and so unified is going to make things very, very tricky indeed. So it's supposed to be the Muslims against the rest. And it's not, is this being done a bit? It's wall to wall, from people like Steve Laws, well to the right of Tommy Robinson, through Tommy Robinson. And I documented back in 2012 how the English Defence League was a wholly owned subsidiary set up by the American an American neocon lobby around Dick Cheney, and it was pushed an enormous scale through people like Rebel Media and so on, through Robert Shillman, the multi-billionaire over in the States who's funded Tommy to a large degree. It's pushed massively by American Zionists, specifically Likud Zionists. So these are the allies of Netanyahu and co. And they push that on a mega scale. But then you go right through to GB News, which is basically a news channel which is about Muslims behaving badly. And that's funded by Paul Marshall, who is a liberal Democrat. And he's a venture capitalist. And his venture capital to start his business came from George Soros. So there's something very strange going on here. So it's wall to wall. And then on top of that, you must have seen Professor David Betts on various talk shows talking, if you've looked into this.
Oh, a while back. Yeah.
So Professor David Betts isn't just some slightly eccentric professor. He's head of war studies at the University College London, King's College London. And King's College London provides the political commissar training for the entire upper reaches of the British military and the upper levels of the British civil service. And they have a £43 million contract with the Labour-run Home Office to do this. Now, if David Betts was speaking out of turn, if he's actually concerned about Islam and so on, that would have been stopped, bang. So he's being allowed to run, just as the British state allows Tommy to run, because they could have had him for drugs or income tax fraud, like they got Al Capone, anytime they wanted. And they don't. They just let him run. And you have several of the main spokesmen, retired generals from the British Army, also now saying, we think there's a civil war around the corner. And Betts' position is, and he explains it actually very articulately, he says that it's really a matter of a law of averages when it's not just Britain, it's also France. And you've had French generals saying the place is on the verge of explosion in the civil war. It's also Germany, it's Holland, it's Sweden. And Betts' position is that if it happens in one place, it'll spread by contagion. And it's not particularly likely to happen in Britain, like 5% a year. But when it's 5% in Britain, 5% in France, 5% in Holland, blah, 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 then in any 1 year, you've got a 40% chance of it going off. Within 5 years, it's going to go off big style. The only question in my mind is Betts just reporting this, and it is a serious issue, or is he actually inciting it? And when he speaks, as he has done repeatedly, he promotes a document called Crown, Crescent, Pitchfork. The Crown is obviously the forces of the Crown. The Crescent is the forces of Islam. Pitchfork is how this manual for terror describes the indigenous resistance. It's put out by a group called Gates of Vienna online, which was also founded by the same people that founded the English Defence League. And it's a manual for indigenous, not just resistance in this, but for our people to, he calls it herbicide, the killing of cities. And it's a staggering piece of race hate, religious hate poison. It's out there, and Betts happily draws people's attention to it. And he hasn't had his collar felt. So this is all deeply, deeply dangerous. Now, whether they can get their civil war, I don't know. 10 years ago, I think it would have been easy, because 20 years ago, Saudi Arabia and Qatar, between them, were pouring vast amounts of money every single year into very radical Wahhabi Islamist outreach groups and so on in Britain. And they had vast sums which they were using to spread their very, very, very extreme form of Islam in ordinary communities. But they stopped doing that. And Saudi Arabia basically has now decided that they switched and they're going to try and create a sort of gay-friendly, liberal, capitalist, soft Islam and have lots of tourists, etc., etc. So they turn that tap off. For that reason, young Muslims are not getting this intense radicalization, which they were, say, 20 years ago when we were up against them. So there's that. There's also the fact that 20 years ago, most young Muslims, particularly the lads, well, none of them went to university. Now it's more than half their girls go to university, and coming up for half their lads, far more than our lads. And once they get to university, obviously they're going into a giant brainwashing machine. and a lot of them come out of it. A lot of them turn queer, so gay, probably, as this is going somewhere where perhaps queer is an improper term. So a lot of them turn gay. Most of the girls come out feminists. At the very, very least, they're coming out wanting careers and they've got to pay back their debts. So they're not going to go back to their community, immediately marry and have 6 kids. So their birth rate is dropping through the floor. It's still above ours, but it's dropping very, very rapidly. And the aggression out of their community is diminishing. They're becoming more like the soft, effete, brainwashed Brits, that are around us. So they don't want to fight. They will fight if the crazy whites can be wound up enough, including perhaps by hoping that Rupert Lowe is going to do something. There's a political route, all faith in the political route. And in 2029, it goes fut. And at that point, there'll be, we'll start 120, 150,000 people who will have committed themselves and paid money for this political cause to try and save their country. And it's no longer there. What do they then do? And it only takes one group of them to say, after something like a mugging gone wrong or another 15-year-old girl raped by a couple of blokes who shouldn't even be in this country and have only just got here, and a gang of them go into a Muslim area and attack a Muslim property, possibly a mosque. And because the Muslims run the taxis, the minicabs, within 5 minutes, they will have 50 or 60 people there, tooled up with iron bars, very tough, very hard, and knives, and they will kill someone or several people. It's all it takes. It goes bang. And if it does go bang, you talked about your sort of family connections to Ireland and so on. The British Army now is a quarter of the strength of the British Army, which was almost at full stretch to keep Belfast and Londonderry calm. There was only 400 IRA men at their peak. That was it. Belfast is a small city.
Yeah.
There's no comparison. There is no possibility that the police could keep the 2 communities or the 3 or 4 communities apart if they actually start fighting. And the army is so pathetically small that that wouldn't do any good either. For that matter, the army is still primarily white working class, and to let the army loose in Bradford would be to risk an utter conflagration, because they're quite capable of going wild and shooting everyone in sight. Bloody Sunday. And incidentally, the Paras who carried out Bloody Sunday against the Catholics, they're also hated in the Shankill, because a couple of weeks before Bloody Sunday, they also opened fire on a Protestant crowd in the Shankill.
Really?
Because they were out of control. These are young men of 18, 19, full of testosterone, and they're terrified. And one of their mates has been killed by one of these bastards. So, they go wild. So the British Army would not be a good thing to try and keep Birmingham quiet with. So there's a serious, I think it's those who say it's going to happen are massively exaggerating it because they want it to happen. I don't want it to happen because no one will win. I spent a lot of time.
Can I just jump in there, Nick?
Yeah.
Because the first one's just a comment. I remember with Douglas Murray in the build-up to the Armistice Day protest with the Palestine marchers, some of the things he was on a trigonometry episode, and some of the things he was saying in that really, really threw me. That he was just being aired as it was nothing. So I take your point on that. I guess 2 other questions on this is, you say that this British Army and the police couldn't handle it. Do you not think with Southport they were able to stop that very quickly with the state forces? And I guess the other question is, why would people promote this? I know that on other channels, and you have just here said that obviously this is an awful thing and anyone promoting it is a joke, and no one wins in the end in these sort of conflicts. Again, like both of us just say it's not a thing to advocate for, but why do you think some people are promoting it?
There was a question before that. What was that?
Do you not think they dealt with Southport?
Yes, Southport? They could control Southport, and the riots. Well, they weren't really riots, were they? They were noisy protests with a fair bit of alcohol taken, and there wasn't that much actual violence. And it was only one community. It was the whites coming out the Brits in quite large numbers, but the communities were not clashing. It was very close in a couple of places. Basically, they didn't clash. So the police can always deal with a white crowd because white crowds are soft, quite simply. And the police have had 20 odd years of liberal indoctrination. They're quite happy to batten working class whites, to beat the shit out of them. They cannot do that, especially with Muslims. They're all, it's too politically incorrect, it's more than their job's worth, blah, blah, blah. But because it was only one side, they were able to keep it under control. Whereas when you've got two sides who want to kill each other, if the police stand in the middle, both sides attack the police. And the police will run because most of them are pathetic. The little girls are 5'2", and college wimps who've had an excess diet of wokeism. So the cops will run and resign and hide if it really kicks off. I tell you, they're not like the cops used to be. But even if they did stand and fight, there's not enough of them to keep. Yes, they could keep, say, the whites and a working class estate in Halifax from attacking the Muslims and vice versa. They could probably keep Wrexham under control. They did. That was fighting some years ago. There were massive riots in Wrexham 20 years ago between local lads and Iraqis, and the police managed to calm that down. But that took police from all over Wales, the West Midlands, Liverpool, and Lancashire. It wasn't just the local force. One they can cope with, two or three they can cope with. Goes off in 20 places at once, and they simply aren't there. And at that point, I've seen enough of mob violence, including in Brixton with black crowds in the early 1980s. I've been involved in riots in Northern Ireland. I've seen plenty of riots. And when it really kicks off, a crowd mentality takes over. And people do just crazy, insane, horrible things. And that's why they won't be able to control it. Now, why would anyone want this? Two, first of all, this is it's an intention to drive the British people so mad with hatred for Muslims that they're quite prepared to stand by, if not applaud and have their government send weapons to the genocide of Gaza, to a war on Iran, to the future wars that, in order to establish Eretz Israel, Greater Israel, apart from anything else, they have to take over half of Saudi Arabia. How are they going to do that? When they had the Iraq war and the British public was so thoroughly against it, the working class wouldn't fight, the middle classes wouldn't pay taxes. And there was this enormous resistance to it. That, I think, was a warning sign to the people who want these series of wars in the Middle East, that they had to do something to get the Brits on side. But not just the Brits, the French, the Germans, etc., etc. So there's them doing that. It's without a shadow of a doubt, basically. If people doubt it, just go and do some research. You'll find pointers and evidence coming out of your ears very quickly. I have a separate thesis for which there is far less evidence, other than what I mentioned, that it's the same playbook that the United States, the CIA and co. used against the former Yugoslavia. And America, the people running America, are not our friends. They are not on our side. They have forced Europe to commit energy suicide by Russia, by sanctions, which are not aimed against Russia, because Russia is able to sell its oil elsewhere. The sanctions against Russia are actually aimed at Germany, the German industry, and Italian industry, and British industry. The Nord Stream pipeline, okay, carried out by the Ukrainians, but obviously they wouldn't have done it unless the CIA gave them the nod. So that wasn't an attack on Russia. That was an attack on Germany, because Europe and Britain are rivals to the dollar, and the dollar is crumbling. The petrodollar is already dead, and the dollar as a reserve global currency is crumbling. The only way to keep America wealthy and stable when it's up to its ears and beyond in debt is either to push the dollar up, can't be done, it's a deindustrialized mess, or push other people down. And they created a war to tear Yugoslavia apart. They've had George Soros, who everyone points to George Soros as, oh, it's a Jew. And they don't step back a bit. The George Soros for 50 years has worked like that with the National Endowment for Democracy to provide most of the funds for what he's done. That is the CIA. So when people are just looking at George Soros, they're not seeing that behind this is the deep state of the United States, which helped create the First World War to destroy the European empires. helped create the Second World War to finish them off. And equally, they are always at war with Europe because America is run by a criminal, kleptocratic monstrosity. And they're not on our side. And for them to tear Britain and France and Germany apart in civil war gives them two things. Pushes the dollar up vis-a-vis them. Sorry, three things. It also means that when it's all over, they can come in with some sort of Marshall Plan and say, if you give us all your farmland, we'll rebuild your cities and so on. Isn't that nice of us? And then the third thing is that America has, and Elon Musk, who's a very powerful figure with the people now really around Trump, he knows this very well. America has a terrible demographic problem, demographic winter, the same as us. The people who actually make America function, basically European Americans, are dying off and not replacing themselves. So America has a long-term problem. Robotization can deal with it to an extent, but America needs more European Americans. Hasn't got them. They did a little experiment the other year, a good thing in a way. They said to the Boers in South Africa, if you want to come to America and stop being persecuted as a tiny white minority in South Africa, you come to America. And some did. And I believe that a key factor of what America is doing is that at some point in the not too distant future, if the Trump revolution thing actually manages to survive the chaos that's going on now, which is perhaps unlikely, if you had a post-Trump Republican Party government, and when the Middle East's oil industry is lying in ruins in a few weeks' time, America and Venezuelan oil is going to be far more valuable. So America can, to a degree, be rebuilt. But to do it, they need 20 or 30 million more young whites who want to go and become Americans. And what better way to get them to go than if Britain and France and Germany and Denmark and Sweden and Holland are Civil War basket cases with no future, only danger, and America says, come to us, and millions will go. So I think they want this as well.
That's fascinating, Nick. Thank you. I could ask a million questions on that, but we're running out of time.
It's a big subject.
We could talk about the Middle East wars, or you propose to talk about global lockdowns 2.0. And I think if it's okay with you, we'll talk about the latter, because we talk about this channel about Israel and Palestine a lot. So, and yes, I think we touched on that anyway. So can you, I'll be honest, I'm ignorant, naive on this. What is global lockdown 2.0?
Well, you know what global lockdown 1 was?
Yeah.
The COVID operation, right? I think probably all your viewers know that. So that was that one, but it was only ever experimental. It could only ever be temporary, and it was, in due course, relaxed and stopped. But the World Economic Forum, which isn't a standalone thing, it grew out of the Rockefeller Foundation's pushes in the 1960s, the limits of growth, and the idea there's far too many people, we've got to restrict industry, etc., etc. It grew from that. And the World Economic Forum has quite openly said that we need to drastically shrink the carbon footprint of humanity. And they've also said very openly, there's no point looking at the people right at the top, the people who fly around in private jets, because there's so few of us that even if you stopped us flying in private jets, it wouldn't make any difference. So leave us and our private jets, please. We're above this. And then they also say, then there's lots of people in the third world, but their carbon footprints are actually already so low, generally, that you can't depress them anymore. So they're not a target either. The target is the global middle class, which is you, me, and all your viewers. That's the key target. And they want to reduce our carbon footprint. How the hell do you do that when you have a political system which is at least in theory a democracy, and which you have populist parties which are part within the system but quite prepared to go rogue if there's enough support to allow them to? So it's now very unstable, this. So how the hell do you clamp down and have basically the lockdown they need? And they've talked, we need a climate lockdown. They said it's quite open. We need a permanent climate lockdown. People to fly far less on foreign holidays. People to eat less meat. People to live in 15-minute cities. This must come in. They make no bones about it. But it has to be sold politically, and it's politically unsaleable. If, on the other hand, Iran, I'm certainly not going to talk about Israel and Iran, but if Iran can be provoked, which we might see in the next few days, they've already had nibbles at it, if they can be provoked into destroying the energy infrastructure of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Bahrain, the United Arab Emirates, which they're capable of doing. It's a question if they want to do it. If they can be provoked into doing it, then you no longer just have a blockade or a double blockade, keeping hydrocarbons flowing from the Middle East temporarily. You don't have a Middle East hydrocarbon industry. It's all in ruins. So when Trump was saying, he hasn't said it again for a couple of weeks, but he said repeatedly, if the Iranians don't behave themselves, we're going to destroy their desalination plants. You've probably seen that. He'll be saying this. Now, that sounds like a terrible threat to a desert country, doesn't it? But Iran isn't a desert country. It's the size of Germany, France, and Spain put together. It's enormous. It's got huge mountain ranges, enormous rivers, lakes, reservoirs, all the rest of it. It has 2% of its water, just over 2% of its water comes from desalination plants on the islands in the Gulf, because they don't have rivers and reservoirs, and pipelines are difficult. It's cheaper to have a desalination plant. So Iran doesn't need desalination plants to exist. Saudi Arabia gets 70–80% of its water from desalination plants. So if Iran's plants are attacked and they retaliate by destroying Saudi Arabia's, it's good night Vienna for Saudi Arabia. 10 million people, including the ones who work the oil rigs, will be out of water in 48 hours. So that's it. So you destroy that. So that's where we get a global climate lockdown 2.0, because we're that close to them actually destroying 25% of the world's hydrocarbons, 40% of the world's helium. You know, the only country in the world that produces more helium, without which you can't make computer chips, by the way, that's the point of helium. There's only one country in the world produces more helium than Qatar. Do you know which one it is? The United States of America. The United States is now sitting on vast amounts of Venezuelan oil, which is heavy oil, ideal for diesel and stuff like that. But it's very thick. It's quite expensive to refine. It's not really worth refining. It's not worth putting vast amounts of money into the infrastructure to rebuild it after years of sanctions, unless the oil price is much higher than it has been. If there is no oil coming out of Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., for 10 or 15 years, then that does the job as well. Finally, on this, America's fracked gas was a sort of bubble. They're producing vast amounts of fracked gas, but it's so expensive to produce that for most of the history of the gas fracking operation, it's actually been financed by people pouring money into it. It's a sort of Ponzi scheme. The price that liquid natural gas is now, American frack gas all of a sudden is extremely profitable, and they've got vast amounts of it. So as long as the prices remain like they are now or go even higher, then between Venezuela and the Canadian tar sands and the frack gas and everything from actually the continental United States, the greater North America, which Hegseth has talked about, which Elon Musk's grandfather proposed back in 1940 as the technate, the greater North America becomes, if there is no energy coming out of the Middle East, the greater North America becomes the world's main source of spare hydrocarbons. And China is at present still drastically reliant on Middle Eastern hydrocarbons, but is moving away to electrification very rapidly. So there's a brief window of opportunity in which the United States of America, although suffering a lot of economic pain at home, as we will in spades, the United States of America stands the possibility that China basically collapses because it doesn't get enough energy, and because its export markets, which is what its economy is based on, simply die, because the world is going to go not into a little recession, but into a full-blown depression. And that is what is going to produce lockdown 2.0. And it's quite clearly deliberate. Trump is not mad, or if he is mad, he's just being used by people who are not mad. They are very, very bad. There's only two ways this might not happen. It's going to happen, this, unless either China says this is simply too much of a risk, we haven't diversified yet enough, and they send their Navy to confront the Americans in the Gulf, and the Americans depart, or it could spiral into World War III, and that's, you don't need any oil when you're dead anyway. So China could stop it, because probably China would beat America, because China can lose half its fleet and China will have a month of national mourning. America loses 100 Marines and America's in hysterics. So America can't take the losses like the Chinese can. So the Chinese might simply say, well, come on then, we'll do this now and end the blockade, and before Iran is pushed into destroying the Middle East, as I believe Iran is supposed to by these people. The other people who can stop it are the sensible generals and so on in the Israeli Defense Force, and the sensible, mainly secular Zionist politicians. The bloc in Israel, who on October the 6th, 2 years ago, were on the point of going to civil war against Netanyahu and his side. And those people are still there. And if they conclude that the war that Netanyahu wants to stay out of prison, and which Schmottrich and the other crazed religious lunatics want because they're mad as a box of frogs and think it's going to bring the Messiah back, etc., etc. So if the sensible secular Zionists decide that the Iron Dome has actually got too many holes in it, and we're getting too many Merkava tanks knocked out by Hezbollah fiber optic drones, etc., etc., we need an armistice, at least a truce, if not peace. Then if they can force the crazier people in Israel to go for peace, then you get peace, and this doesn't happen. But if the current leadership of Israel stays in control, and if the Chinese blink or simply think we can survive, we'll bide our time, then you're going to see chaos in the Middle East. It's only just starting.
I'll be honest, Nick, I'll probably have to watch this back to make sure it all goes in. That was that was a lot.
And we possibly need to watch it in 6 months' time to see if I was right or not.
I was going to ask, what's the timeline in your predictions? Is it years? Is it months?
I don't know, because this American war against China, which is what this is more than anything else. Yeah, okay, the Israelis wanted it and pushed Netanyahu pushed, but again, people are looking at the Israelis, they're all blaming the Jews. They're not blaming the people who run the United States of America, many of whom are wasps, but very, very rich wasps, super capitalist wasps. So they're getting what they want, which is gradually strangling China, just by keeping things as they are. So they can just go, in and out with a little bit of war one week and a little bit of peace the next. And every time Donald Trump posts something which leans things one way or another, the various criminal vermin around him placing bets on oil futures, etc., are making billions of dollars. So they've got every reason just to keep this going for quite some time rather than escalate it. But the Iranians have got every reason to escalate it, because if they escalate it, in the end, Trump will basically end up blitzing the Iranians. And then once the Iranians are blitzing the America's allies in the Middle East, Trump will just disappear. It's job done. And that is potentially, well, the Iranians are the ones pushing for that because they know that's what's going to happen. Trump is going to create all sorts of chaos. They may devastate the rest of the Middle East, but he's not going to destroy Iran. Iran is simply too big and too stable that even if they nuked it, if they nuked Tehran, it wouldn't destroy Iran. So Iran only has to emerge from this standing to win. But they need to do it sooner rather than later, because they too are gradually being strangled financially. And, obviously not everyone in Iran is hardcore Muslim revolutionary. So they risk, if this goes on for 6 months, they risk potentially being overthrown by a war-weary population. So I think the Iranians will want to bring this to a head within a month, is my guess, but we will see.
Fascinating. I must be honest, Nick, when you emailed about wanting to discuss, when I see the word lockdown, I get these feelings inside of I don't know, pure anger about what used to happen a few years ago. Yeah, and I can't really believe it actually. I know it's a separate topic. I can't really believe it actually happened.
No, it will happen. That it happened, or it's
going to happen. I can't believe it did happen. And
it did. No, indeed.
What happening again is
it's quite astounding what happened. But in terms of can it happen again? Well, simply if aviation fuel is, if it's available 5 times the price of what it was 6 months ago, then the super rich, the rich will still fly. Politicians will fly to their various conventions, but you and me won't be flying. It'll simply be too expensive. Or if we do fly, we might save up for 2 years to go on a foreign holiday, perhaps. Not go for a short break, as many people do, 6 times a year, something like that. That's going. That's going.
No, fascinating. Like you say, we'll come back in 6 months or a year and see how this prediction went. Nick, thanks for honored. We've had you for an hour and a half tonight. Thanks very much for your time. I'll say what I say.
Very interesting questions, and do please let me know what your viewers think. I'll be interested to hear it.
No, absolutely will do. I'll finish off by saying what I say to all my guests. Where can people find you on social media?
You can find me on X, Nick Griffin, BTP, which stands for Beyond the Pale, but I'm nailed to the floor there. You can find me on Telegram, just Nick Griffin. And most of all, do come and join me on Substack. If you haven't come across Substack, it's a really good app. It's free, but there's a vast range of really good writers write on all sorts of subjects. Its algorithms are very good. You'll find things which interest you, and it really is a fine thing. If you're a writer or a producer, you should be on Substack. It's pretty uncensored. It's got a wide range. It's got people, everyone from the far left through to some fairly crazy people on the far right. If you love conspiracies, there's some fantastic conspiracy stuff on Substack. But if you don't like it, you don't have to look at it. So I'm on Substack. I blog there or write there, quite long articles generally, more or less every day, about 6 days a week on average. I'm there as Nick Griffin, Beyond the Pale. Do come and join me.
Thank you, Nick. And for any new viewers tonight, please do like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. And yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks all.
Thank you.